It's normal to ask what society can do for us, what we can get from society, what we can get from a constitutional system. But sometimes it's good to ask what the constitutional system, what the society needs from us. And we remember President John Kennedy's very famous statement in the early 1960s when he encouraged Americans not to ask what the country could do for them, but what they could do for their country. And that's a good thing to bear in mind at all times, but perhaps especially when the social fabric of the country seems very fragile. And I just want you to notice these numbers here that came from a poll from the Wall Street Journal and NBC, which indicated that in 2007, 60% of those who were polled did not feel that the generation of their children would be as well off as they were themselves, that is, those who were asked. That was in 2007. Only 7 years later, that number had risen 16%. More than 3/4 of those who were asked did not feel that their children's generation would have a better future than they had had themselves. And that is a basic element of the American dream, the idea that each generation can do better than the one that came before. These numbers have never been that high. And there is a feeling among some that the social fabric of the country has become weak. And I think this is illustrated in this article here by Peggy Noonan, a widely, I think, generally respected journalist who describes a conversation she had with a very accomplished person, accomplished in the areas of politics and finance. And she refers to a conversation she had with him. And she said, the conversation took a surprising turn. My acquaintance said it's possible the U.S. in our lifetimes will simply break up, tear apart. And so this isn't an opinion, coming from a radical voice on talk radio or a radical voice on the internet, but from a generally respected journalist who reports a conversation from somebody she takes seriously, who wonders if this nation really can even hold together. And so there are reasons to be concerned about the social fabric of the country, and for that reason perhaps it's in our interest to think about what we can do. Now, Alexander Hamilton was one of the key people involved in the argument on behalf of the U.S. Constitution. He argued for the ratification, that is, the approval of the U.S. Constitution in the late 1700s. And one of the points he made was that it was reserved to the people of the young United States to decide, and then notice what he says, by their conduct and example, whether societies are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice. In other words, are people really capable not only of speaking about freedom, but in using freedom in a way that is not finally self-indulgent and destructive? Now, one of the things that I think Hamilton would agree with is that if a people is going to demonstrate that it is worthy, that this people is worthy of liberty, of freedom, of maintaining order and stability and prosperity within a free system, then one of the basic things I think that would come along with that is a critical mass of people in the population who are basically aware of what's going on in the world. It's hard to speak intelligently about the political system, for example, if you don't know how it operates. If a person does not know how many people there are on the Supreme Court, if a person does not know how often senators are elected, if a person does not know how many senators each state in the United States has, if a person does not know why California has more members in the House of Representatives than Michigan does, in the absence of this kind of basic information, it's hard to imagine the same person then speaking intelligently about how the system should function. And we have to say that studies consistently show that Americans are not well versed in really basic knowledge about their own political system and in international affairs. And this comes to us from 2009, so it's a bit dated, but I think it makes the basic point As of 2009, the United States had been involved in military operations in Afghanistan since the fall of 2001, so a number of years had gone by. And a group in Afghanistan called the Taliban had been in the news constantly for years. And so people in Denmark and Finland and Britain were asked to recognize basic information about the Taliban. And in Denmark, 68% of the Danes were able to do so. That number actually seems low to me. 75% of the British were able to do so. 76% of the Finns were able to do so. But only 58% of the Americans were able to identify basic information about the Taliban, even though the U.S. was the leading operator in Afghanistan. Now, 58% is a majority. But there's a significant minority, 42%, that even after years of almost daily news articles about the Taliban, of almost daily news about the Taliban, still did not possess basic knowledge about American foreign affairs in relation to Afghanistan. Now, this can't be because Americans don't have access to news. As the graph below shows, Americans spend plenty of time watching TV. They spend plenty of time on the internet, but apparently they don't spend much time keeping themselves abreast of basic information about how the political system works, about the country's foreign affairs, and so on. I wonder if Alexander Hamilton would see this as an indication that perhaps in our conduct and example, we're not really demonstrating that we possess the skills, so to speak, that we really possess the desire to maintain a strong, prosperous, stable society, because it seems that a basic element of that is a desire for knowledge about, what's going on in the world, what's going on in the political order, what's going on in the economy, having some basic information about that. I think another thing to notice is that Hamilton warned against a dangerous ambition that often lurks behind the specious or fraudulent mask of zeal for rights. Of course, Alexander Hamilton defended the idea of rights as they are spelled out in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. For example, the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom to protest when we feel that the government is infringing on our rights. He would defend these. But I think what Hamilton was concerned about was an emphasis on rights in the absence of an equal emphasis on responsibilities. Now, in 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt announced a second Bill of Rights. Of course, the Bill of Rights are there in the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Franklin Roosevelt announced a second Bill of Rights. And one of the things he said that every American had a right to was a useful and well-paying job, a useful and well-paying job. Well, just for the sake of conversation, let's say that this right actually does exist, that people have a right to a useful and well-paying job. A question to ask is, do people then also have a responsibility to ensure that they are themselves employable? In other words, that they possess the skills that these well-paying jobs actually require. And so we have an article here about a factory that, as the article says, is giving us an example of the latest attempts by U.S. companies to produce what the education system too often struggles to deliver: high school graduates with adequate workplace skills. We can say that we have a right to a good job, but that doesn't mean anything in the absence of the personal responsibility that is required to acquire the skills that job requires. And so to claim the rights without also recognizing the need for the responsibility, I'm not sure makes a lot of sense. I think Hamilton would agree with this, that we need as a society to be interested in the skills that exist within the society, and there's a certain responsibility, of course, held by parents to ensure that the young are being well prepared for their futures. Franklin Roosevelt said that people have a right to adequate medical care. For the sake of discussion, let's say that this right actually does exist. Do people then also have a responsibility to take care of themselves? I have a right to medical care, But does that mean that I can treat my body horribly? I can make all sorts of bad decisions in relation to my health and just let society pay the costs or pass the costs on to insurance or something like that? Do I have responsibilities? And there are a lot of things we could look at that indicate that perhaps this responsibility is not being tended to very well. But let's just notice that in the second decade of the 21st century, 71%, so almost three-quarters of young people in the United States were not eligible, did not qualify to serve in the Army or the Navy. And there were a number of reasons for this, but one of the reasons has to do with health. And here we're not talking about congenital conditions people are born with, or diseases that develop. We're talking about conditions that come about as the result of choice. And so young people, as a result of choice, find themselves in situations where they are so unhealthy that the military will not accept them. Perhaps that's an indication that that this is a responsibility that needs some attention. If I have a right to medical care, that's one thing. Do I have a responsibility also to myself, to those close to me, to my society, to take care of myself as well? Franklin Roosevelt says that the American people have a right to a good education. Let's assume that this right actually does exist, that people can claim this right. Well, what sense does it make to claim that right in the absence of a sense of responsibility to actually pursue an education? And let's notice that American adults in the early 21st century, so this would be people 18 and older, in terms of reading skills, American adults came in number 16, behind Australia, Sweden, Finland, and many other countries. In terms of math skills, American adults came in number 21 among developed nations, far behind Japan, far behind Belgium, etc. And then, of course, we know that adults can't hand on to the young what they themselves do not possess. And so we see that the numbers for our youth are even less inspiring. And so American students came in number 24 of industrialized nations, far behind Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea. This is in terms of reading. American students came in far behind Liechtenstein, the Netherlands, Taiwan, in terms of mathematics, number 36. In science, American students came in number 28, behind Vietnam, behind Estonia, behind Poland. And so we could talk about a right to education, as Franklin Roosevelt did, but perhaps it's also useful to talk about a responsibility. What responsibility do adults have, not only to ensure that children are attending school, but to ensure that children are actually learning, and to maintain standards so that students really are learning and are being well prepared for the competitive future that faces them. And then when we think about rights and the decisions that people make which cost others, we would have to link that to the national debt. Now, there are a lot of reasons for the national debt. We can't go into it. But as of January 2014, the national debt was over $17 trillion. If you divide that debt by the number of citizens in the country at the time, it came to $54,000 per citizen. If you divide that debt by the taxpayer, and this would be the payroll taxes, then it would be $150,000 per taxpayer. Now, again, there are a lot of reasons for the national debt, but one of the reasons for the national debt is that there are folks who are reliant on others to meet their needs in terms of health, in terms of food, in terms of housing, and so on. And some of that need is genuine, but some of that need comes about as the result of choice, people making choices that are destructive to themselves and others, and the costs are real. And so American citizens have rights, but do they have responsibilities to the extent possible to be self-reliant, to the extent possible to not become reliant on strangers in the form of taxpayers? And we have to say that this debt is going to be passed on to the children. Do today's adults, do today's grown-ups, do today's taxpayers have a responsibility not to pass on such a massive debt to children? And so rights are vital, but I think Hamilton would agree that we also want to attend to responsibilities. John Jay is another person who played an important role in arguing on behalf of the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. And in the course of his argument, he makes the obvious point that distrust creates distrust in a society. It's in a society's interest to promote trust. Therefore, it's in a society's interest to be inhabited by people who are pursuing trustworthy lives, lives of decency, of integrity, of honesty, and so on. And so we notice here that in terms of trust that exists within the society, the United States is not doing very well. We notice that in Denmark, close to 90% of Danes say that they have a high level of trust in other people living in their society. In Switzerland, the number is about 74%. In Australia, about 64%. In Ireland, about 56%. Look at the United States, 49%, rounded up to 49%, less than half. And if distrust breeds distrust, then it's a worrisome sign that fewer than half of Americans feel that they can basically trust others in the society. It makes life more complicated when we don't feel that we can trust others, because we have to be more protective of our property, more protective of ourselves, and so on. So this is something to be concerned about. And perhaps it's true that the claiming of personal rights in the absence of personal responsibility creates distrust. And it's in nobody's interest to live in a society with high levels of distrust. It doesn't make societies better. Therefore, it's in our interest to do what we can to create a culture of trust. Distrust and corruption in a society absolutely go hand in hand. And so in Sweden, there are high levels of trust and low levels of corruption. The same is true in Denmark, for example. Now, in a different presentation, we talked about this phrase from Thomas Jefferson from the Declaration of Independence, where Jefferson says that people have a right to pursue happiness. And we said that this term happiness is related to a Greek word, which again is translated in English as either excellence or virtue. That to pursue happiness is to pursue some kind of excellence. And the more people a society has who are pursuing some kind of excellence, the better off that society is. People are pursuing excellence as cooks, as teachers, as taxi drivers, as gardeners, as ministers, as choir members, as artists, as business people, etc. There are thousands of ways to pursue excellence. The more people living in a society who are pursuing some kind of excellence, the better off that society is. And of course, this pursuit of excellence has to be rooted, it has to be based in an interest in virtue, which is a bit of an old-fashioned sounding word. But to live a life of virtue is to live a life of honesty, of integrity, of decency, of trustworthiness. Does anybody not believe that a society that has a critical mass of people who are decent, trustworthy, honorable, noble, does anybody believe that such a society is a bad place to live? Of course, the more trust we have in a society, the better off that society is. Therefore, it's in our interest to tend to our responsibilities and to pursue lives that are marked by trustworthiness, and in that way we help to create a culture of trust. James Madison, a very important person in the writing of the Constitution, asked rhetorically, "Is there no virtue among us?" If there is not a critical mass of virtue in a society, James Madison says, then we are in a wretched situation. Well, that is obviously what we want to avoid. The U.S. Constitution is the most successful written constitution in the history of the world. That's indisputable. The U.S. Constitution is the founding document for the most prosperous nation that has ever existed. Not a perfect nation, but a nation that people all around the world have looked to as an example. And it's the nation that people all around the world want to come to. There's a reason for that, because the country's history has been marked by stability, order, growth, not perfection, many problems, but it is a country that has pursued certain ideals. And if there's a concern that the system is breaking down, then it is especially in our interest then to do the things that will preserve the system, that will preserve the society, that will preserve the constitutional order. And this means pursuing responsibility. It means pursuing some kind of excellence. It means pursuing virtue, that is decency, integrity, trustworthiness, etc. Okay, on that point, I will say goodbye. Take care.